This apocalypse came unheralded by omen or prophecy. Yet even before the strangers arrived, the fortune of the Inca Empire had begun to darken. A plague took the life of Emperor Huayna Capac around the year 1528. He would join his forefathers in the halls of Cusco, and the realm which stretched from the jungles and mountains to the desert coast would pass to his designated heir. But the pestilence killed this son too. It may have been smallpox from Europe, spreading from the distant north in the wake of conquest. There had been whispers about strange men along the imperial borders, but the Incas were beset by turmoil from within. Another son of the emperor, Huáscar, claimed the throne. This mad king tormented the aristocracy, shattered tradition, and murdered his relatives in a fit of paranoia. His war-hardened half-brother Atahualpa remained camped in the north with his loyal army. The land ran with blood as the brothers carried on a terrible civil war. And at last, when the warriors of Atahualpa overran Cusco, Huáscar was imprisoned, his wives and children executed as he watched. The millions of varied people across the empire would now answer to Atahualpa, who planned a victorious trek south to take his throne in Cusco. But the ascendant ruler received reports of brightly armored, bearded marauders traveling inland on the backs of large beasts. No more than 200 men. At length, the intrigued Atahualpa decided to grant them an audience. Thus began the fall of the Inca Empire. The Incas built a mighty empire of monuments, aqueducts, and fine metalworking. It's that feeling of innovation that makes Forge of Empires so satisfying to play. Like the Incas, I quickly expanded my city by investing in technology, managing resources, and conquering opponents, which you can do on the world map or PvP. And I like that you can build historic structures such as the Colosseum and Notre Dame. I love that Forge of Empires is super easy to start. You can play right now in your browser just by clicking the link in the description, or if you prefer, it's also on mobile with over 130 million downloads. Forge of Empires is giving History Dose viewers a boost to start. Use my link or QR code and get access to all of the rewards on screen right now, with more rewards once you do the tutorial and reach the Bronze Age with the Welcome event. So start playing today. Each breath drew in heavier among the peaks. Here the signs of empire grew more frequent, be they the paved roads or hilltop forts. The armored strangers and their handful of enslaved Africans were not lost wanderers. In 1492, Columbus had ended the long and near-total silence between the two halves of the world, and the Spanish invasion began. Aided by disease and native rebellion, Hernán Cortés conquered the Aztecs of Mexico, while others pushed farther. Now, a decade later, it was a distant cousin of Cortés, the roughly 54-year-old Francisco Pizarro, who led a perilous quest into the Inca world. The intrepid and stern Pizarro had scouted parts of the South American coast on 2 previous voyages launched from Central America. Having found evidence of a gold-rich civilization, he had received the official blessing of Emperor Charles V for this present mission. The Spaniards did not desire alliance or trade, but conquest. They plundered storehouses, gathered intelligence, and, translating through a previously captured indigenous man, made contact with Inca imperial representatives. After many arduous miles, the Spanish arrived at the town of Cajamarca, where a meeting with the new Inca ruler Atahualpa would take place the following day. Marvelous temples and walls of masterful stonework bordered the streets. Captain Hernando de Soto rode out for a preliminary audience with Atahualpa, for their host was not in the city. That night the surrounding hills glowed with the firelights of a large Inca army, warily camped some distance away. These Inca warriors were thoroughly battle-tested. Hailing from across the empire, Inca troops could possess shields in varying degrees of cloth armor. They attacked at range with slings and bows, and closed the distance with spears, maces, and other sidearms of stone or bronze. In victory, the Incas often spared enemy soldiers, but executed hostile commanders, turning their skin and bones into drums, flutes, and goblets. Yet Inca weapons would not pierce the steel armor, helmets, and shields possessed by the Spaniards, who fought with swept-hilt swords and polearms, as well as crossbows and a handful of arquebus firearms. Pizarro and his crew counted only 168 fighting men, but they were seasoned soldiers. Most had spent considerable time in the New World, and a few officers were veterans of the conquest of Mexico. Atahualpa tarried the next day, until at last he was carried on the royal litter into the sprawling plaza of Cajamarca, flanked by several thousand men. The Spaniards appeared to have vanished. A Spanish friar then approached the ruler and spoke a paraphrased form of the requerimiento, the demand given to native peoples of the New World to submit to the divine authority of the Spanish crown, with the warning, "And if you do not do this, then with the help of God we shall make war on you everywhere and in every way that we can. We shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and His Majesty. We shall seize your women and children, and we shall make them slaves, to sell and dispose of as His Majesty commands. We shall do all the evil and damage to you that we are able, and I must insist that the deaths and destruction that result from this will be entirely your fault." He handed the emperor a prayer book. Atahualpa, confused at the obscure markings on its pages and indignant over the thieving conduct of the Spaniards, cast it onto the ground. The Spanish now had a pretext to proceed with their plan. From hidden positions around the plaza, the Spaniards emerged with a salvo of gun and cannon fire. The Incas were choked at narrow exits and pressed against walls as armored titans trampled over them. The wave of steel claimed limbs and heads, and after hours of fighting, the plaza was left a mutilated heap of Inca warriors. The attackers succeeded in capturing Atahualpa alive, and so he became a hostage king in Cajamarca, compelled to ensure his people obeyed the invaders. Unknown to him, Europeans had first entered the empire during his father's reign. A Portuguese castaway named Aleixo Garcia washed up in Brazil with some of his companions. He joined the Guarani people in a large raid on the Inca Empire in 1524, but died the following year. The curious Atahualpa now inquired many things of his captors, and they of him. It was seen that, like the Spanish, the royal Incas claimed divine authority. They believed Inti, the venerated sun god, had given them this empire, and so long as the echoes of the divine dwelt in the heavens, rivers, and mountains, none would take it from them. Though the Spanish faith remained mysterious to Atahualpa, he had at least discerned their lust for silver and gold. He proposed a sort of ransom, either to win his freedom or merely save his life. He promised Pizarro that within 12 months he could fill half the height, or around 8 feet, of a 22 by 17 foot room with gold, and also twice the entire room with silver. The astounded Pizarro agreed, and precious metals from across the empire would soon arrive heap by heap in Cajamarca. Realizing his precarious hold on the throne, Atahualpa had his imprisoned brother Huascar assassinated. The hostage emperor was nevertheless obliged to allow the Spaniards to plunder and wander his lands. It was as though the conquistadors had entered a parallel thread of time, men of the old world stumbling into the Andean cradle of civilization, whose people's history and sacred pantheons were utterly alien to them. They knew nothing of the ancient aqueducts and fountains, the gods of Tiwanaku, or the pyramids of the Moche. And it was only about a century before the Spanish arrival that the one called Pachacuti Earthshaker established the Inca Empire. The armies of the Inca flooded down the mountains, offering peace and wealth to those who submitted, and death to lords who challenged them. The language of Quechua served as the imperial lingua franca. Using collections of chords called quipus, their learned subjects recorded their history, took inventory of imperial supplies, and collected census data to inform labor taxation, military conscription, and food production. With colossal stones, the Incas built mountain estates, temples, and forts. And connecting it all was a vast road system, some 25,000 miles, bridging over chasms and lined with relay message stations and supply posts. The Spanish roaming the empire could hardly make sense of what they saw. In human memory, I believe that there is no account of a road as great as this, running through deep valleys, high mountains, banks of snow, torrents of water. In all places it was clean and swept free of refuse, with lodgings, storehouses, sun temples, and posts along the route. Oh, can anything similar be claimed for Alexander or any of the powerful kings who ruled the world? A few Spaniards journeyed to Cusco and marveled at its planned and paved streets. There they beheld Coricancha, the Temple of the Sun, whose walls were topped by sheets of gold. There were a great many treasures here, including the priceless Imperial Garden. Life-size sculptures of llamas, birds, other animals, and human figures, beside a field of maize and flowers, all of it made of silver and gold. The Incas believed gold to be the sacred tears of the sun. In Cajamarca, the gold and silver of the empire soon filled the ransom space. The Spanish promptly melted the over 40,000 pounds of holy items into ingots and divided them amongst themselves. Such was the dream of every lowly conquistador who dared undertake such a fateful journey. Shares were determined by rank, and still each ordinary man received a fortune worth millions of dollars. However, over 100 reinforcements had recently arrived under the command of Diego de Almagro. Almagro was Pizarro's partner on the previous expeditions to the South American coast, and he was incensed to receive almost no part of the ransom. At any rate, Atahualpa had delivered the treasure, but he was not freed. Over 8 months of captivity, he had regaled his captors with his intelligence and even learned to play chess, but the Spanish had detected fault lines within his dominion. While many revered the sacred rule of Atahualpa, the Inca legacy of conquest, tribute demands, and forced resettlement had made certain subject peoples hostile to the emperor. Moreover, to the great fortune of Pizarro, the Inca Empire was freshly bleeding from the civil war. Armies were depleted, and followers of the late Huáscar remained mortal enemies of Atahualpa. The life of this strong-willed ruler and the fear that he may rebel now seemed a burden to the Spanish. They hastily convicted Atahualpa of treason and ordered him burned at the stake in July of 1533. As he was dragged to the place of execution, Atahualpa repeated, "Why are they killing me? What have I done?" He was given the choice to die by strangulation instead of fire, if he permitted the priests to baptize him. He accepted, perhaps because the Incas held the preservation of the body to be paramount for continued existence after death. The Spanish duly conferred the blessing of baptism on the sovereign, and then choked the life from him. Although the invaders had come in search of land and riches, the sincere belief that they carried salvation to the otherwise doomed souls of these foreign lands added a moral and religious dimension to their imperial aspirations. As Spaniards now encountered splendid Inca houses of worship, they described them as mosques. The specter of old world holy wars still loomed in their minds. It was less than a century before that Constantinople fell to the Muslim Ottomans, and Columbus reached the New World the very same year that his royal benefactors completed the Reconquista, the expulsion of Spain's erstwhile Muslim rulers along with Jews. Even now against the Incas, the Spanish battle cries invoked Santiago. The belief that the Apostle St. James had once miraculously returned to lead the Spaniards to victory in a battle against the Moors. Enlivened by a sense of divine fate, the Spanish departed Cajamarca and undertook the long march to Cusco. If some passing subjects hailed them as liberators who had toppled a false king, others wished to vanquish the regicides. No longer bound by the coerced commands of a hostage emperor, Inca generals and their troops attacked the Spanish army and their indigenous auxiliaries, only to be crushed and scattered by the armored riders. Pizarro suspected certain indigenous allies of duplicity and had them burned alive. Still, Pizarro preferred to subdue the land with politics and not costly war, and so selected a 17-year-old named Manco to act as a puppet ruler. Manco was a son of Huayna Capac, who had recently fled persecution from the soldiers of Atahualpa. Now he and other Inca nobles joined the conquistador procession into Cusco. Manco Inca was crowned in a month-long ceremony, attended by the mummies of his great forefathers. That true power belonged to the Spaniards was plainly visible. Pizarro divided the palaces and great buildings of Cusco among his conquistadors, who proceeded to loot the city of nearly all its gold and silver artifacts, to be melted into ingots. The Spanish would do the same with almost every silver and gold item they found across the empire, such that only a few of these Inca relics survive today. Outside of Cusco, defiant Inca generals resisted the invaders over the next year, but backed by the authority of Manco Inca, the Spanish and their allies would defeat them. Conquistadors soon branched out to reap their encomienda rewards, rights to the labor of peoples across the empire. Pizarro, it seemed, had completed the conquest. His remaining enemies now lay within his own ranks. He and Almagro made competing claims for land and authority in the conquered realm. Confrontation was averted as Almagro led an expedition of over 500 Spaniards and 12,000 Incas to seek gold and expand the empire's southern dominions, while Pizarro went west to his newly established capital, Ciudad de los Reyes, or Lima. For all his cunning, the judgment of Pizarro was clouded by familial loyalty. He had left his impudent brothers, Juan and Gonzalo, in control of Cusco. The pair began to mock and extort Manco Inca for treasure. Conquistadors had ravaged indigenous women and claimed them as war prizes throughout the conquest. Now the brothers and their men openly violated the royal wives and relatives of Manco Inca. Gonzalo himself kidnapped and ravaged Cura Occhio, Manco's principal wife and sister. The outraged Manco Inca knew his people thought him a hollow ruler, who served only the foreign Vandals, but no longer. Manco stirred his advisors to secretly set in motion a rebellion, a vast uprising to cast off the Spanish yoke. The Spanish promptly imprisoned Manco Inca on suspicion of treason, but the arrival of another Pizarro brother, Hernando, came with the royal command that the Inca king was to be treated with full dignity. Free again, Manco Inca rallied the rebel army. Across the empire, Inca subjects rose up and killed their encomendero overlords, and in the hills and valleys beyond Cusco, a great Inca army assembled. Some 100,000 warriors from across the realm had answered the call of Manco Inca. The Spanish trapped in Cusco numbered only 196 men, supplemented by a few enslaved Africans and 500 indigenous allies. In early May of 1536, the siege of Cusco began. Warriors swarmed the streets, and a gale of stones and arrows forced the Spaniards back to a few fortified positions, from which the foreigners cut down waves of attacks. Hernando Pizarro saw to it that any prisoners they took, including women, were executed or had their hands severed before release. Unable to dislodge the Spaniards, the Incas then began to burn their own sacred city. But in fiery sorties, Spanish cavalry charged out and cut down hundreds of Incas, who in turn developed anti-cavalry tactics. Incas pockmarked the streets with pits, sharpened stakes and barricades, and then flooded the surrounding area. The besieged Spaniards required a more defensible base. A Spanish and allied force sallied out and stormed Cusco's colossal fortification of Sacsayhuaman. For days they fought for inches, beaten back, battered by stones, until at last they scaled the high walls and slaughtered all the Incas within. Condors, they said, circled down to devour the dead. The Spaniards successfully held this new base, but the advance had come at a cost. A projectile had fractured the skull of Juan Pizarro in the first assaults and taken his life, and still Cusco remained surrounded. In Lima, Francisco Pizarro had been apprised of the rebellion. With fewer than 600 troops in his core area of conquest, each soldier appeared vital to the survival of his new domain. He dispatched reinforcements, with 70 cavalry sent to break the siege of Cusco. Manco Inca had predicted such a maneuver and already sent his finest general, Quiso, to the area. Through spies, Quiso and his army tracked the cavalry force, destroyed the bridge behind them, and in a narrow canyon, ambushed them. The trapped cavalry met rolling boulders, slings, and melee charges. Incas crushed, clubbed, and butchered the screaming invaders, taking only a few prisoners. Quiso proceeded to exterminate 3 more Spanish contingents. A frantic Pizarro sent letters pleading for Spanish reinforcements from Central America. Back in Cusco, the besieged Spaniards meagerly survived on food smuggled in by indigenous allies. By September, some parts of Pizarro's original rescue force did reach the city. The Incas gifted the Spanish 5 heads of their would-be rescuers. But the Incas, not fully aware of how written script functioned, had also delivered torn-up letters from the dead soldiers. The besieged Spanish, in an hour of utmost desperation, now gleaned from the letters that Francisco Pizarro was alive and fighting to break the siege. They would not yet abandon the fight. In January of 1537, Hernando charged out toward Manco Inca's base of Ollantaytambo, where he planned to capture the rebel king. But in the valley, the Spanish beheld mountains roiling with warriors. Volleys of furious stones and arrows repulsed the Spanish, who fell back to Cusco. The Inca triumph proved fleeting. Inca forces around the city had diminished over the 10-month siege, as many troops returned home to meet the demands of agricultural cycles. In months earlier, General Quiso had stormed Lima. Without the terrain advantage central to his tactics, Pizarro's men killed him and much of his army. Spanish forces, including freshly arrived reinforcements and the returning army of Almagro, now converged toward Cusco. Manco Inca would not suffer a massacre. He called off the siege and gathered his family, officials, and sacred valuables. Over mountains, through defiles, rivers, and woods, his caravan came to the place called Vitcos, then moved farther into the wilderness after a Spanish attack. Vilcabamba became the capital of a new jungle kingdom, where the exiled line of Incas would live on in shadow. Beyond the edges of this neo-Inca state, the conquistadors, driven as they were by land, title, and riches, turned against one another. Almagro conquered Cusco for himself and imprisoned Gonzalo and Hernando Pizarro. The war between conquistador factions began, and after the Battle of Las Salinas, Pizarro executed the vanquished Almagro. Francisco Pizarro and his men reveled in their newfound prestige and power. The Princess Kushiri Mayokyo, once ceremonially appointed the primary wife of Atahualpa, was only a girl of 10 years old at the time of the Spanish invasion. Now, 6 years later, the 60-year-old Pizarro took her as his concubine. She would bear him 2 sons. Deep in the forest, Manco Inca beheld the empire of his forebears defiled and gutted. Still, he would not yield. He forged a new kind of army. The sparsely clothed peoples of the Amazon, long considered barbarians by the Incas, now became his allies in a guerrilla war against the Spanish. Raiding parties emerged from the wilderness. They ambushed and slaughtered traveling Spaniards and plundered anything of use. And so some of this underground indigenous army began to traverse the jungle on horseback, or with steel helmets, swords, and guns. Fear spread among Spanish settlers. Gonzalo Pizarro resolved to move against the shadow capital of Vilcabamba. In 1539, he led 300 Spaniards and many auxiliaries on a maddening march through misty, trilling jungle, down sharp cliffs and coursing rivers. The Inca forces gave them battle but soon fled, leaving Gonzalo to sack the capital and again kidnap Manco's most beloved wife, Cura Occhio. The Spanish thereafter sent envoys to Manco Inca to arrange his surrender. Manco had them killed, so Francisco Pizarro repaid the gesture by having the exalted Cura Occhio stripped, tied to a stake, then beaten and shot with arrows. To the revulsion of even conquistador onlookers, the Pizarro brothers had overseen the torturous murder of an innocent noblewoman. When imprisoned Inca chiefs expressed outrage over the murder of their queen, Francisco Pizarro had them all publicly burned at the stake. The power of Pizarro relied on loyalty. Not all of his original conquistadors had chosen to stay in South America. Hernando de Soto now encountered the varied peoples of the American Southeast and became the first documented European to cross the Mississippi River. Back in Peru, Manco Inca exploited divisions within the Spanish ranks by allying with an anti-Pizarro faction led by the vengeful son of the late Almagro. On June 26, 1541, this faction ended the life of Francisco Pizarro with a blade in the throat and took power, only to be later violently ousted themselves by a crown-appointed governor. Spain sought direct control over her new land and subjects, for the bellicose conquistador dynasties had plundered and waged war in the distant New World with outsized authority. Some ousted Almagro supporters fled to the Neo-Inca state, where nobles and warriors walked paved roads hung with vines, where stone marvels revealed themselves and cool water streamed from fountains. Manco Inca offered the hunted Spaniards refuge here, and in return they trained his Inca troops to better use the firearms, weapons, and horses they had captured. It seemed a new chapter in the resistance movement, but in secret the allied Spaniards hoped to curry favor with colonial officials. So in 1544 they turned on their host and stabbed Manco Inca to death. The Neo-Inca state survived under an heir, but already the surrounding world had begun to change. The heartland of the Inca Empire, now a frontier of the unstoppable Spanish Empire. Cities of foreign architecture mapped the valleys and filled with newly arrived Spaniards, while indigenous inhabitants were made to work. Subjects of the Inca Empire had previously paid an annual tax of generally 2 to 3 months in labor, building infrastructure or monuments, tending farms, or making textiles. The Incas rotated tax demands so as not to strain communities, and provided subjects food in times of emergency. The new Spanish masters co-opted this labor system, demanding more work in harsher conditions and leaving many families destitute. Some were sent into the underworld. A Spanish missionary wrote, "In 1545 there was discovered a mouth of hell, into which have entered a great quantity of people, which by the greed of the Spaniards they sacrificed to their god. And these are some silver mines that they call Potosi." Enslaved Africans and over 10,000 native laborers each year were forced into the mountain, into dark and stifling mines which claimed the lives of many, while a massive town of 100,000 people grew like moss around the fount of treasure. For the next century, nearly half of the world's silver came from Potosi, the envy of sovereigns from Europe to the Ming dynasty. In response to accounts of abuse and atrocity across the New World, the Spanish crown implemented some legal measures to regulate the treatment of its indigenous subjects, who nevertheless would continue to suffer exploitation, abuse, and social degradation by dint of heritage. Opponents of Spain and Catholicism in Europe would promote both real and embellished accounts of Spanish atrocities in what was later called Leyenda Negra, the black legend which cast Spaniards as uniquely unjust among the burgeoning colonial empires. That their opponents also brutalized people did not soothe the conscience of certain Spanish clergy and soldiers who believed their countrymen had disgraced God in the former lands of the Incas. Conquistador Cieza de Leon lamented, "Many, many times I have seen with my own eyes severe things done to these unfortunate people, and those who read it have patience because I cut short what I am relating. and do make use of reading about it to supplicate our Lord to pardon such grave sins. By 1572, just 4 decades since the invasion, disease, war, and hard labor had killed almost half of the native population in the fallen empire. Some survivors carved out status in the new colonial hierarchy, preserving history and traditions in doing so. And others, no doubt, still looked to the forest with a dream that the Neo-Inca state would resurrect the old empire. By then, Tupac Amaru, son of Manco Inca, sat on a lesser throne. He had hardly a chance of evading the Spaniards who hunted him in the wild. Soldiers brought him in chains to Cusco, and before a crowd of wailing onlookers, the conquerors beheaded the last Sapa Inca. So ended the Inca dynasty. A path remained for the people of the conquered Andes, a long trek of assimilation and resistance, peace and bloodshed, subjugation and sovereignty. And centuries later, among the high peaks, villagers and their herds still walk the old Inca roads, speaking Quechua as they go, and weathered walls and temples stand silent across the land. The last witnesses of the great Inca Empire. Quick reminder, today's sponsor, Forge of Empires, is available to play in your browser right now and on mobile. Access rewards when you use my link below or the QR code on screen, and start forging your empire today. Thanks.